Welcome everybody to the April 18th San Joaquin Valley REAP workshop. Today is the second workshop of the series of three. It's the second one with Veronica Tam and company to help us walk her through our understanding of AFFH a little bit better. I'm Michael Segala, consultant out of the Fresno Clovis area. I work on the Valley-wide REAP program. With me today is Randy Hatch. Randy, can you say hi?
Hi.
Randy is also with the SJV REAP team, but he's also our guest panelist from time to time, given his long land use history of being a practitioner here in the Valley. Let's see. A couple of house rules. Veronica will make her presentation, and then you can ask questions as we go along or wait till the end. We have the ability to ask questions by raising your hand, by using the question and answer function, or by using the chat function. This webinar will last approximately 1 hour. This webinar is eligible for APA AICP credit, and we will post the credit numbers on the screen there that you see. And we will record this webinar and post it to the SJV website in about 2 days. And then afterwards, in a couple of days, I'll send you a post-workshop evaluation if you could help me fill that out as well. So that's the intro. Let's go ahead and get started. Veronica Tam is one of our consultants on the bench for the San Joaquin Valley, available to help out any city that has any questions or technical assistance needs with AFFH. And go ahead and introduce yourself, Veronica, and take it away.
Okay, well, I am Veronica Tam with Veronica Tam Associates. We are a small firm based in Pasadena, but we've been, and I personally have been involved in updating housing elements since the beginning of time. And we've done certainly a lot in the past, and also many housing elements this round, starting from the San Diego, SCAG region, Bay Area as well, and now in the Central Valley, Central Coast area as well. So we have probably more than 40 certified housing elements in the 6th cycle under our belt. So we are learning as we go regarding housing element, particularly what HCD is looking for relating to AFFH. On the side also, in addition to doing housing element work, we actually do a lot of fair housing studies for local jurisdictions. We do the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice for a lot of areas. We also did the 2 out of 40 or so assessment of fair housing in the nation before HUD actually repealed the rule. But so we are, even prior to the housing element requirement for AFFH, we have been very much involved in the fair housing analysis and planning field. So today, the topic is AFFH outreach and site selection. But I wanted to, I'm not going to focus too much on outreach because in the next meeting, there are 2 other consultants. One of them, I think, is going to focus on outreach. And so I don't want to kind of spend too much time on it, but I do want to kind of say a few things about outreach based on what we learned from HCD. Definitely, AFFH is not doing things as usual. So you have to look at your demographics and when you say, well, we're 95% white, and so we don't need to do other type of outreach except to what we normally do. You will be surprised to hear from HCD is like, well, that's exactly what you need to do above and beyond what you normally do, how do you reach the extra 5% that don't usually participate in the community? And we do get that questions quite a bit if your population is more homogeneous, and you just say, well, we don't have a translation requirement because we are like 90% white or 90% Spanish, or and then HCD is going to ask, but how do you reach out to the extra 5% or the 10%, the minority? That's what AFFH is also about as well. So when you look at your demographics, not only just think about the majority, think about the minority. Certainly you need to outreach to those who have special needs and who are lower income and who are under the protected classes of the fair housing. So protected classes in California is much more all-encompassing. So I think it's just making sure that you touch on the disabled, you touch on the elderly, you touch on the farm workers, you touch on the lower income households, you touch on families and need, the homeless, all of that. Like what is your outreach approach? And if you just say we publish a public notice, I can guarantee you that that's not going to be adequate. And in fact, we talked about it today with another community and social media. Well, social media, if you use the traditional Facebook and Twitters or Nextdoor, you're not actually reaching the younger folks. So you need to go to maybe like Instagram, you maybe need to go to TikTok, because that actually has a demographic that's younger. TikTok particularly, I think the age of the audience is between 20 to 35. That's probably the age that don't usually participate. How do you outreach to these groups with unconventional proactive efforts? What I also learned from HCD about translation is exactly what we talked about is, well, we don't have a translation need because 95% is white and they all speak English or whatever. So that's what HCD comes back and say, what about the other? So in some communities, we go by LEP. If you are a CDBG entitlement jurisdiction, you know what that LEP is. It's a limited English proficiency plan, which has certain criteria of what kind of language services that you need to make it available. But in some other communities, when you have a very diverse population, we use what does a ballot measure language requires when you do go to voting? What language do you need to provide in the ballot measure? Sometimes in a very diverse community, we go by the ballot measure requirements. Another thing that you need to think about in terms of the outreach is go beyond your city limit. If you are just outreaching to people who live in your city right now, you are perpetuating your demographics. You are not diversifying it. You're not promoting mobility within the region. You're not welcoming people who normally don't have the opportunity to live in your community. So when you do the outreach, particularly if you are at the higher end of the demographics, like your community is at the higher end and considered to be a little bit more higher end, higher income, the more of that, the more you need to go beyond your city limit. How do we deal with it sometimes? We like when after this PowerPoint presentation today, I'll probably go in and fill in some of the details that I provide verbally. You can use the school district boundaries. For example, in one community, it's a very exclusive community. When HCD said, well, how do you outreach beyond your city limit? You go by your school district boundaries, which may span across communities. You can also in one city, we are doing it based on the outreach is providing it to nonprofits and soliciting the nonprofits that serve the region to help you with outreach, and because they serve a certainly a demographics that's beyond your city limits. You know, you have the ability to do utility bills, which includes commercial and industrial properties that also have the ability to include people who may be outside, or property owners who may be outside, or employers, employees who are outside of your city limits. So find a way, think about where your city is, and then think about, are you a diverse enough community that you are similar to the region, or if you are very different from your region, and the more different you are, the more you'll be required to go beyond your city limits. The other thing too is document everything. Document. Evidence of outreach is very important. You can do everything you intend to do, and the outcome of the outreach may not be as successful. So at least you would have to show your good faith effort. And then most likely in the housing element, you will have to have a program to commit to ongoing outreach. You don't stop after your housing element is adopted. But I think the main thing is you need to think beyond what you normally do. And you'll hear me saying this all the time. The AFFH is about doing something above and beyond what you normally do in order to bridge the existing disparities. So last time we talked about the analysis that you have to do in the AFFH, segregation, housing choice, and disproportionate needs, and displacement, and local trends, and all of that. When you select your sites, and this is kind of moving into the site selection process, what you don't want to do is that you selected all your sites, and then you come back and say, okay, we can meet our RHNA. You went through all the, writing the draft housing element, then you do the AFFH analysis, and you just, oh, oops, every site is in one area. Then you're going to run into definitely HCD requiring you to think beyond that and see how do you justify putting all the sites in one area. So when you look at the actually, this is something that's related to what I kept this one slide in is because the public comments received. It's another outreach that you need to do, because HCD consider public comments as local knowledge. So only if you have done your outreach, then you can have public comments and you can incorporate that as your local outreach. So I apologize, the slide order is a little off. So when you do your RHNA sites, after you've done your site selection, or even before that, what we recommend doing is, and I think last time we provided a scope, is to print out all the maps for you about the percent of minority concentration, percent of population with disabilities, familial status. These are protected classes. Low income is not a protected classes to some extent, but new state law does protect people who are low income utilizing public subsidies. We are looking at TCAC opportunity areas. Like, the TCAC has different categories based on education, access to education, access to transportation, access to jobs, access to amenities, and concentration of poverty, and also Cal and Forest Green scoring, like exposure to hazards. There is also another category called disproportionate needs, percent of households that are cost burdened, and percent of households that are overcrowded. So the analysis of the AFFH has to go by these factors, and you talk about the existing conditions, how it compares to the region. But then once you started selecting your sites, you have to think about how your site's inventory, how your strategy to meet the RHNA actually move the dial a little bit by either improving the conditions, or at a minimum that you do not exacerbate the existing problems. So when what we usually ask people to do is think about, take a look at the maps, take a look at where the problem areas are. There are ways to avoid putting a lot of housing in those areas. Where are your high resource areas? Are there ways to actually put more sites in those areas? If it's unavoidable to some extent, then you still could, but it means that you're going to have to prove a lot of meaningful actions to improve the conditions of those areas with programs, services, incentives. But this is what we usually do, is look at the distribution of the RHNA sites by AFFH factors. So what we usually do is to take a look at the minority concentration, for example. And in this particular community, this is El Centro. El Centro is Imperial County, in right next to San Diego County and Riverside County, and it's a very there's a heavily farming activities in there, very a lot of large scale kind of large vacant sites, because they're more like subdivisions and master plan communities and neighborhoods, and as well, like, I shouldn't say master plan, but really subdivisions. And so the parcels you can see that are really primarily at the edge of the city, because that's where the growth are, where the vacant land is. But with the housing element, we are doing some mixed use and then some infill, and so that we can have like a distribution of the sites throughout the city. So in looking at the analysis, then what we, again, one of the components of the scope that we do is to take the sites inventory that you give us, that we think this is our site best strategy for the RHNA. We'll take a look at it and we analyze it this way. So are you focusing the majority of your housing sites in areas where there are a lot of low income minority population? In this situation, yes, because the city again is majority minority. Most of the census tracts in the city are over 80% minority, and so are we disproportionately putting it in the minority area? Probably not. And then we are actually diversifying some of these by providing some of the housing units in areas that right now that are less concentrated. The obviously the issue that SCD had was, well, this is you're putting primarily single family homes in the areas where there are less minority population. And there are, in this areas, there are some racial and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty, and we're putting a lot of lower income units in there. That's because the arena is pretty large, and then we don't have a lot of vacant land, and based on market economics in Imperial County, there is no market for redevelopment of existing uses at this point. So we have to explain the strategy, then how we are doing more mixed use in this area by creating a new mixed use area in the northern part of the city. So we are still trying to diversify, and we have to put in a lot more efforts to deal with the areas where there's concentrated areas of poverty. So you have to go through this analysis one factor at a time, and then see how you're improving the area. For example, TCAC allocation. This is again, El Centro. We are looking at the majority of the city is in the low resource and moderate resource areas. Most of the cities, like it's in this light green area. We have only one area that's in the high resource. The majority of them highest resource, and this is high resource, this is high resource. And this, I think this is the area where we have the, unfortunately, that's where we have the, some of the concentrated poverty area. But so again, then you have to explain, okay, if we look at our arena strategy, the distribution is that we do have sites for both low income and moderate income in the highest resource area. We don't have the ability to put all of our sites in the highest resource area in this community because there's only one portion of the city, but we are fairly well distributed, and we try to avoid sites in the high segregation and poverty area. So this is kind of like factor by factor, you do the analysis and you explain your strategy. What are the things that you are doing in order to avoid over concentration or exacerbate the existing conditions, and then combined with meaningful actions, what are you doing to actually kind of remedy the situation in a certain way. And then when you do this, the analysis, HCD also really wants to look at it. It's not just by census tract or like by summary like that. Like if you do a summary of selecting the sites and say, oh yeah, we are providing, you know, a fairly equal split among the three categories of sites. High resource, moderate resource, and low resource, fairly, you know, kind of equally split in terms of arena units. But that actually doesn't tell HCD enough information about how your sites are actually distributed. There's no geographic reference to those sites. You know, it can be in aggregate looks good. But what if your highest resource, your high resource and moderate resource are just in this area? So you're putting all of the housing in this area in one neighborhood and not the rest of the communities. So when you're doing that, when you're doing the selection of sites, you may even have to go beyond just looking at it on an aggregate level like that. When you're selecting the site, pay attention to the individual census tract. And usually when we do the site selection, we also looked at, again, what we talked about, the different factors that we talked about in here. In this particular site, we pay attention to, on a census tract level, what are the characteristics of that census tract? And then how those census tracts how your RHNA is in relation to your census tract. The one thing that HCD also looked at is like, okay, this is census tract, we also try to divide the city into either quadrants or into neighborhoods, so that when you're selecting sites, pay attention to whether the geographic distribution is to some extent as even as possible. It's impossible to be totally even, but at least be cognitive about where the sites are, and maybe divide the area into your city into neighborhoods that people can recognize, that when you write about the site inventory, they know that, oh, this is in the Highlands area, or this is in the bungalow neighborhoods. This is in the whatever neighborhood names that people can associate with. That's maybe one way that you look at it. What is also important to HCD is, well, what is you may be saying that you're only putting 100 units in this one census tract compared to 200 units in another census tract. But if this one census tract only has 50 housing units right now, and you're putting 100 of low-income units, then all of a sudden you are like doubling the number of low-income units in one census tract currently. Whereas if you have a census tract that's primarily residential, that you currently have 1,000 households in that census tract, you're only putting 200, or even just the same 100. So the proportion is not the same. So when you look at site selection, you need to also look at proportion too. How is that being distributed? Not just in numeric, it has to be in relation to what is existing in that neighborhood. So in this particular map, it'll show you that we are dividing the city of Jurupa Valley into 14 different neighborhoods. Now, I don't recommend that many, because sometimes it's very difficult to handle, but the 14 neighborhoods is because how the general plan is has actually those defined neighborhoods. So when we write about the housing element, it does show what that people would automatically recognize what it means when you talk about sites. And so that helps for public comment. And this is, again, the sites that shows, in some areas, we have mixed income sites. In other areas that we are talking about, just basically allocating the sites by particular income category. Doing sites planning for your RHNA is also very important when you have a lot of sites in a particular neighborhood. Even if you qualify to count all the units as lower income because of density, you should think about doing mixed income strategies, because the more the larger the sites, the larger the concentration, the better that you do mixed income if you can afford it. Not just, even if you say that a site is 10 acres or 8 acres and you can get 240 units on it, it would be much better that you say, well, even though it's able to facilitate 240 lower income units, realistically, we expect only X% of that would be, or we assume only X% of that site to be lower income. So having the mixed income strategy would help you even if you have concentration in particular areas. And so this is, I think this is from Berkeley. Yeah, I think this is on the system. This is how it looks like when we talk about, this total in the area one, we're looking at, 674 units. and these are the conditions, and then you'll explain why it does not exacerbate the condition, or that it does improve the conditions. Now, there are always, I hate to use the term, but there are always different ways to spin your strategy, to explain how you're going to, why you're doing what you're doing, what are the challenges that you face in terms of doing your site's inventory. But when it comes to a point where you can't, there are just going to be issues, we acknowledge that. That's where the meaningful actions are going to be critical. How you're going to use the meaningful actions to further fair housing to actually to mitigate the impact of your site strategy. So I haven't planned for a very large, long PowerPoint. I think this is actually the end of my PowerPoint. I was going to talk a little bit about meaningful action, but I want to stop and see if there are questions about site inventory.
Thank you, Veronica. Any questions for Veronica at this moment? I have a question. The methodology you laid out in terms of the variables and the tables and all that, is that in the AFFA guidebook from HCD, or is that something Veronica Tam and Associates came up with?
Well, the scope of the analysis is in the guidebook. The methodology is what we developed. And so that's the scope that we offer is once you do your preliminary sites inventory, give it to us. We'll do the analysis based on those factors. And then we'll come back with a meeting with staff and kind of pinpoint the areas that we think there are problems, or like kind of red flagged it for you, and that we think HCD would have a concern. Then you can go back and see if there are ways that you can diversify or disperse your site's inventory differently, because we do, like we looked at it as if we were HCD. So we'll look at your sites and say, oh, I think you're going to have a problem here. I think you're going to have a problem there. Now, whether you'll be able to fix your site strategy, we understand there's a lot of local politics involved, but that's where the meaningful actions is going to have to supplement the site strategy.
We have one question from Mark Staples. For small cities where the urbanized area and adequate sites are only in 2 census tracts, and there are no real neighborhoods, how would you further break down the site's inventory to explain the city's situation to HCD?
So we are working on some really small cities right now. I don't think your city is smaller than the one that I'm working on. Mine is only 1 census tract, population 800, and I think with about 200-300 housing units. So you still have to show the distribution of the sites geographically, because you're showing the sites by parcel level and overlay onto census tract, you still would have some kind of distribution. When you say that the site is in 2 census tracts, I think what I'm gathering is your city is not just 2 census tracts, but your sites are in 2 census tracts. Now, there are ways then you can talk about how other means that you are going to provide opportunities in other neighborhoods. Now, in Berkeley, all of our sites are along the transit corridors, like and that's where, you know, it's we know we've been talking about this. There are competing and conflicting state goals. Like they want you to do transit-oriented development. They want you to do smart growth, concentrated like growth along like transit corridors. But then when it comes to housing element, they come back and say, well, you know, all your sites are along this one area. So there are conflicting goals. And with Berkeley, we have most of the sites along the transportation corridors. So what we have in the AFFH is to show your trend of your ADU development, show your trend in SB9, if you have any SB9 trend, and show your trend if you have a recycling of like lower intensity residential into slightly higher intensity. So for Berkeley, they have a lot of single family homes being demolished and built with a duplex or triplex in the medium density neighborhoods. So even those activities are not in your site inventory, because you can't show parcel specific analysis of sites for those activities. We put it in the AFFH analysis to add in the dimension of how additional opportunities do exist in your community outside of those two census tract areas.
Thank you. Any other questions? Not seeing any.
Well, yeah, and let me walk you through a separate one that's quickly about meaningful actions. And I'm not going to go through a lot of things in there because it would be overwhelming for a lot of communities, but the AFFH is going to be one of the most difficult components of the housing element, like I always say. It's a quick thing about meaningful actions. After you've done all the analysis, after you've done your site strategies, the arena, and you've kind of looked at your oops, this is not what I wanted to do. Okay, never mind. Okay. After you've done your sites analysis, this is our arena strategy. There's nothing we can do to do about the sites now. What do we do? So you need to take meaningful actions. What is meaningful actions? It's not business as usual. Nothing irks a city more when you say ongoing citywide, continuing to do this citywide. So that is business as usual. You're not doing anything meaningful to bridge the disparities. You have to do above and beyond. You have to take proactive efforts. You cannot just rely on outside agencies, particularly fair housing. You cannot say, oh, we refer fair housing complaints to Echo Housing or to like legal aid. You have to take proactive actions to outreach and educate about housing choices. Outcome is about moving the dial a little bit even. It's like, how do we change? How do we reduce the concentration of poverty? How do we expand housing opportunities in a neighborhood? Again, this is relating a little bit about the outreach strategy that we talked about earlier. Meaningful actions have 5 themes, and let me see. Oops. I think I for some reason I didn't list the 5 themes. So one theme is fair housing enforcement and outreach. Fair housing outreach continues as you implement the housing element. You can't, like, outreach does not stop with the adoption of the housing element. And when you do outreach, it's proactive, not just posting online. Direct mailing, texting, dedicate at least an issue of the city's newsletter, increase subscription to the electronic newsletter. One thing that we kept being asked by HCD is there's no physical newsletter anymore for many communities, and it's usually relying on electronic. The problem with electronic subscription is that if you don't subscribe to it, if you don't know it exists, the electronic subscription usually reaches a couple of thousand people email addresses, and it doesn't cover this city. How do you increase the subscription, diversify the pool of readers who subscribe to your electronic newsletter? Targeted outreach in specific neighborhoods with disproportionate needs. This goes when you're directing your housing element, when you're developing a housing element, and when you're implementing. All of these is like when you're developing your housing element, but also when you're implementing your housing programs. If some of the neighborhoods have a higher concentration of renters who are cost burdened, how do you step up the outreach to that neighborhood regarding rental housing assistance available? So if you just say, well, we advertise about our rental housing assistance program, online, that is not meaningful action, because that does not do above and beyond to reach a targeted neighborhood and targeted group. So you have to do beyond that. And I talked a little bit about that. And outreach and has to go beyond the city limits, especially if you're exclusive. One thing that I have a couple of clients are starting to do is even review your planning and zoning documents for discriminatory policies and language. You'll be surprised at a lot of planning documents may be still using very old terms, and that may be considered discriminatory. A pet peeve of mine is, instead of calling seniors, old planning documents used to say senior citizens, and I don't use the term citizens because citizens has a different meaning, and just seniors. So and in another community, instead of talking about multi-family housing, they changed it to multi-unit housing, because or single family housing is just single unit housing. But that this is not something that you need to do, but I think I'm seeing a lot of cities, some cities are being more proactive in reviewing their own policy documents. Now, here's programs that you can think about relating to what that earlier question about what if your sites are only in 2 census tracts. Then you need to think about what you can do to promote mobility, meaning that, a variety of housing types, and also allowing people to move to areas of their choices. So ADUs and SB9, and providing workforce middle housing, and that may be beyond your RHNA, live work units, and other things that you may not consider as a housing site because of Project Home Key, like where are the locations of hotels and motels that or homes that you can do acquisition for Project Home Key. That can be sites that are beyond your RHNA sites. That's outside of your census tract areas that you have. New opportunities in high resource areas, also again relating to what you talked about, that you only have sites in 2 census tracts. What about SB9 and ADU? Again, what are the opportunities out there? And we are starting to see a lot of jurisdictions doing religious and institutional facility housing overlay. Religious facilities and institutional housing those may not be in the urbanized area. They may be in single family neighborhoods. But by doing an overlay, by providing housing in those areas, you could go beyond your urbanized areas and go into more of the single family neighborhoods. the whole concept of 15 minutes neighborhoods, that's another way of looking at creating opportunities in single family low intensity neighborhoods, such as allowing the corner lots in single family neighborhoods to become a duplex or triplex. And so again, those may not be sites that you can indicate in your RHNA strategy, but that's strategies that you can mitigate the fact that you have concentrated sites for your RHNA. Place-based strategies, that again is another mitigating strategy if you have a lot of your sites in one neighborhood. What are the targeted improvements that you are going to put in those areas? So you have no choice but to put those sites in those areas, but what are the improvements that you have also planned to improve the conditions? The other thing that you need to think about is if you are utilizing mixed use or you're creating mixed use neighborhoods, mixed use zoning this round for your regional housing needs allocation, you are essentially converting a non-residential neighborhood into residential neighborhood. What are the complementary services and improvements that you need to put in to make that neighborhood livable? What are the quality, like complete streets, safe out to schools, community benefits to get amenities? These are all, again, ways to mitigate the fact that you are concentrating certain sites in areas. And this is like, and the last group is tenant protection and anti-displacement. Those are not necessarily relating to the site strategy, but having inclusionary housing is another way that you can mitigate where your sites are being concentrated. So. There's a question, are we able to list ADUs in the sites list not but a program goes? Yes, that's exactly how you are going to do the ADUs. Now you need to use the trend of how many units of ADUs you have permitted. It has to be permit, and it needs to be consistent with your annual progress report to HCD. And usually they start looking at the trend since 2018, because 2018 is when the new laws about ADUs began. So you look at the number of ADUs you permitted every year since 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. You do an annual average, and then you project that into 8 years over the planning period, the housing element. That's how many ADUs you can credit for it. You can then take that but you cannot automatically assume all of those ADUs are going to be affordable, even though the premise of the ADUs ordinance or the law is that they are an alternative source of affordable, but you're not allowed to automatically count them towards being an affordable unit. So what you would want to do is to do some kind of rent survey in your community about this, take a look at the size of the ADUs you have. If you have a lot of junior ADUs, garage conversions, which are smaller ADUs, then maybe a higher proportion of your projected ADUs can be assigned to lower income. But if most of your ADUs are 2 bedrooms, like 1,200 square feet ADUs, then you can't really count them towards lower income. So you have to still have to look at your market rents in order to qualify the proportion of ADUs that you project as being lower income or not. And after this call, Michael, I can send like an example of how that is being done in terms of ADUs. CIP stands for Capital Improvement Plans. And so that's talk to your public works department. Maybe they have planned for major infrastructure improvements in some of the neighborhoods that you're dealing with. Maybe they have planned for ADA accessibility improvements in some of the low-income neighborhoods, and so that you can qualify them or maybe they have planned for parks improvements. So those are things that you can qualify as neighborhood improvements, place-based strategies for creating livable, suitable and living conditions. So
Yep, very good.
that is it.
Randy, any words of wisdom here?
I was just thinking about how it would apply to some of the jurisdictions I work with, and since they're small, it's difficult.
Right.
Because they're not large areas, so I tend to focus in on small infill lots and the ADUs. Hard to find a half-acre site even.
Right. And I think one thing that definitely think about is take a look at is religious facilities. We do have a very strong trend in California with religious facilities having the interest in doing housing. And one thing that we also suggest we're working on a religious facility overlay for the city of Long Beach. So we're tiering the churches and the churches and other like temples by the size, because not everybody is large enough to partner with a nonprofit to build affordable housing.
Mhm.
But if they are small, you could consider allowing them as if they are a residential use and allow them an ADU on site or 2 or 3 units on site. Now, if you just do a 2-unit duplex or something like that, it doesn't require, a contractor can help them do it. And so we have a lot of smaller properties that may be interested in creating it or allowing them to convert their existing extra space into junior ADUs on site that there's like the groundkeepers or the staff can live in. Just kind of that would be requiring like treating those properties and those uses as if it is a residential use. And so those are some of the things that you could actually utilize it for your arena sites if you do something like that.
It might be possible also, if you've got some second-story commercial space, to look at that as a housing opportunity as well.
In the city of Mill Valley, in the Bay Area, it's a small city, very exclusive, very expensive, but they do have a trend, and they're seeing a trend, and they're seeing a lot of empty offices on the second floor. So we did do in our arena sites, as also part of the way to diversify the location, the distributed in the sites we take. We identify, the staff identified, they literally drove by and looked at, for lease signs for second floor offices. They have a project example, and we calculate how much space can be converted into housing, and we are getting some units from second story conversion of offices. Yeah, so those are some of the strategies that you do to try to provide middle income housing, moderate income housing, the missing middle, which allows you to go beyond just 20 units to the acre, 30 units to the acre, but something that is a little bit more beyond your typical site inventory. School district, now I don't know whether that is possible, but we are seeing schools, we're seeing hospitals that are approaching cities to build housing for their staff. And particularly for public schools and colleges, there's new state law that says that if they want to build housing for their staff on site, they do not require to go to the city to ask for a zone change. and that's new state law.
Mm.
You can extend that to medical facility, hospitals. We keep hearing about like nurses. The registered nurses make more money, but the lower level nurses and nurses aid, they don't make enough money. So we are in the city of Laguna Beach, we actually have 2 hospitals approach the city that they want to be included in the sites inventory. They want to build housing on their sites. So those are some of the strategies to go beyond, like to go outside the box, to think outside the box about where to put more housing.
We also have a lot of commercial parking lots too here in the
Right.
valley. Yep.
Yeah. So and just like a caution, this is not a sites inventory like session, but when you turn, HCD does accept like shopping centers to be converted, but think about the easiest way to do it is not to take the entire shopping center, because they are going to ask you to provide substantial evidence of the existing uses being able to go away. But in most cases, we are able to convince HCD that you can reconfigure just the parking area for the housing. So,
okay.
And again, mixed income is very important to avoid the over concentration when you do the AFFH analysis.
All right, well, that's all we have time for today. Veronica, thank you so much. Randy, thank you so
Sure.
much. Been very useful. And when you hear it over and over again, it finally starts to sink in. So thank you so much. To get more on AFFH, we have our next workshop on May 16th. So Rincon Consultants, Estelano Advisors, and Veronica Tam Associates. They are all our AFFH technical consultants that are under contract with the San Joaquin Valley REIT program, available to help your city with different sort of levels of engagement if you need it. So please don't be shy about requesting technical assistance if you think you might need it. Sooner would be later.
And Michael, if we can just emphasize the urgency of this, because your housing element is due, some of your housing element is due at the end of the year, and some of you is due February. But that means you need to release the draft housing element sometime in the summer. So the early summer. So like getting this started is very critical. So
okay, in terms of the release of the draft housing element, when does the release of the AFFH report happen?
it has to go with the housing element.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like HCD gave us a break in the Skag region and allow us to trail it in, like to submit the housing element first and the AFFH a little later, only because they released the AFFH guidance like in April, and our housing element is due in October. And so that was the only reason why they were a little bit more lenient. But today you have to have both. The AFFH is part of the housing element. It's not a separate component.
Okay. All right, very good. Well, thank you, everyone, all of our panelists and all of our participants in this webinar, and we'll see you again on May 16th.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye now.